So now that we've evolved anatomically modern Homo sapiens and we've seen their dispersal around the world during these glacial and interglacial periods, we're going to talk about the changes that start to come. And so this is that point where we're really undergoing this shift from prehistory to history, and kind of landing ourselves squarely within the subfield of archaeological anthropology. Some of what we talked about at the end of lecture 4, as we were discussing the origins and spread of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, there are archaeologists who are working with prehistoric populations, absolutely, and those populations, like the Clovis people in the United States, the Folsom people, etc., would be studied by archaeologists versus paleoanthropologists. But yeah, anyway, so we're going to talk about many of the cultural changes that come at the very end of um, this last glacial period and kind of set the stage for the domestication of plants and animals. And so we will ask ourselves, where and when did the Neolithic originate? We'll talk first about the Mesolithic and then about the Neolithic. And then we will talk about the similarities in the Neolithic economies of the Old World and the New World, and the costs and benefits that are associated with food production. And so we were mentioning at the end of this last lecture, lecture 4, that there were changes that came with the retreat of the last glacial. And if you recall, the last glacial period was called the Würm Glacial, and it retreated from the Middle East roughly 17,000 years ago, and from Europe closer to about 12 or 10,000 years ago. And so what this did was dramatically change the climate. I mean, when there is a lot of ice or water taken up in glaciers, coastlines are farther out, for example, with more land exposed. I mean, this is what gave us the land bridge or Beringia and allowed us to cross into the New World. Also, when things are captured in ice, it's relatively drier, so there's not a lot of opportunities then for diverse species of plants to grow. And so the broad spectrum revolution specifically refers to the lifestyle and kind of the capacity for sedentary populations of hunter-gatherers to rely on a variety of plant and animal foods at the end of this last ice age. It really sets the stage as kind of the prelude to the Neolithic because it allows for the emergence of sedentism, which means that we're living in sedentary villages. We're no longer nomadic. We're kind of setting up shop and living there for the long term. So we see, for example, that we start living in structures, that we start storing food, a whole suite of changes that kind of set the stage for plant and animal domestication. And so this broad spectrum revolution emerged around 15,000 years before present in the Middle East, around 12,000 years before present in Europe. Foragers had to pursue a more generalized economy. Prior to this point, they had been big game hunters. And that's really, we talked about how this drove the settling of the Americas, for example, following the herds across the ice. And so the kinds of plant and animal resources that were present after the retreat of this last glacial were fundamentally different in nature. Prior to this point, as nomads, we were big game hunters. We were going after what we call megafauna, really large animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, etc. After the broad spectrum revolution, we've got animals like deer, like rodents and lagomorphs, rabbits. We've got gazelles in the Middle East. We've got smaller bodied mammals that are relatively solitary in nature. They don't require as large of a home range, so we don't have to migrate to follow herds of them. But we also have to change our hunting styles. Big game, megafauna, requires cooperative hunting. It requires kind of a team of hunters to be able to take down the prey, and then there's food sharing as a result of that. The kind of hunting that sedentary foragers are doing during this broad spectrum revolution is more of a shift towards solitary hunting endeavors. You don't put together a large party to go hunt rabbits, for example. You learn how to do things like trap and snare and set those on more of an individual basis. And so in Europe, the broad spectrum revolution encompasses the late Upper Paleolithic and also the Mesolithic. In the Middle East, the broad spectrum revolution corresponds with the emergence of what we call the Mesolithic. So, if you recall, the Paleolithic referred to the Old Stone Age, and we talked about those distinctions between the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic. Mesolithic, if we go by kind of the Latin root of the word, simply means Middle Stone Age. And it's characterized by a particular tool type that we see emerge called microliths. Microlith is Greek for small stones. And so what we do with microliths is we take a bunch of really, really, really small points and we embed them in like a shaft or something, to fashion a larger tool out of these small stone points. So if we had a piece of wood or a piece of bone, for example, and we cut very small kinds of projectile shaped points and embedded them like teeth in that piece of wood, we would end up with something like a saw that we would then be able to use to woodwork, to build structures, to build boats, etc. We also started to see the development of things like fish hooks and harpoons. When the glacier coastlines change. Water is then released from its frozen state, and that kind of drives the shoreline farther inland. And so, as we think about where the shore and where the ocean, like where the land and where the ocean would have met during the height of these glacial periods. If you recall from movies like Finding Nemo, right? He gets on the back of the ray, they go to their school field trip, and there's this kind of mythical point that they're not supposed to approach. And in Nemo, they call that the drop off. Well, that drop off still exists. It's just nowadays that drop off is certainly covered by water. And there's a shallower point that is also covered by water. When that shallower bit right off the shore is called the continental shelf, and this is where you find a lot of the coral reefs. This is where the tide moves in and out. You get marshlands. You get kind of estuaries. You get just these seasonal or even daily cyclical changes in what's covered and what's not. And these areas on the continental shelf are teeming with life. So, with coral reefs, if you've ever gone snorkeling or diving, there's an abundance of fish. Not huge, let's say tuna or marlins or something, but certainly a lot of smaller bodied fish. If you've spent any time in the Pacific Northwest, as the tides move in and out, you take advantage of low tide to go dig up shellfish like clams and oysters. Um, this area covered by the continental shelf also, as if we think about marshlands, sets up breeding territories, sets up breeding areas for shorebirds and such. And so we've got with shorebirds, we would have the opportunity to gather eggs or to even hunt the birds themselves. So we need to innovate new tools to be able to take advantage of these new marine habitats. So we end up with fish hooks, harpoons. We develop axes, chisels, gouges for carpentry. There's another tool that's made of these microliths that is kind of a curved wooden handle that has not quite a hook at the end, but certainly curves around, and then you embed small blades in it. This is kind of the origins of the scythe. The scythe is used to harvest wild grains like wheat, barley, oats, etc. And guess what? One of these characteristics changes in the plant life during the broad spectrum revolution was the proliferation of stands of wild grains like wheat, barley, rice, millet, and so forth. So we see new technology associated with both plant and animal life. We see new hunting techniques emerge. We start to, for example, set traps, and snares for smaller bodied game. We also see the emergence of a new style of projectile point. Anatomically modern humans that moved into the New World following megafauna brought with them certain kinds of spear points, and then the technology of the atlatl to be able to throw the spear farther and harder. It's during the Mesolithic that we see the emergence of bow and arrow technology. And so, think about hunting shorebirds, for example, going geese or duck hunting. You need a bow and arrow. You're not going to be able to throw a spear far enough to shoot down these waterfowl after your domesticated dog may have flushed them out of their nesting grounds or hiding points. So that's this third bullet point here, that we've got two phases of domestication that led to contemporary dogs. Dogs were domesticated very, very early, and roughly 40,000 years ago for the origins of dog domestication. But during the Mesolithic, we see the second phase emerge where we really start to differentiate among types of dogs. And so, just having gone from a general dog who's a companion and may help with hunting now to selecting for particular traits, we get rat terriers, for example, developed to keep rodents out of stores of grain. We get retrievers for specifically for like hunting waterfowl. Animals with a soft bite that are able to go and collect the birds that we've shot down. So the Middle Easterners then begin to cultivate plants and breed animals by about 10,000 years before present. Farming and herding don't reach Europe, Western Europe, until about 5,000 years before present. And it was really farmers and herders from the Middle East that moved into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago that gave rise to these European economies that then were based on farming. As big game supplies dwindled, foragers shifted to species that were more solitary, that were able to reproduce prolifically. So they offered a very strong kind of basis for the diet because they were going to have high population numbers, things like fish, mollusks, and rabbits. With this comes sedentism, and with this comes a change in a lot of the cultural features. So, for example, pottery emerges pretty early and was innovated, for at least in the Jomon culture in Japan, to cook stews of salmon and shellfish. The world's oldest known pottery dates to southern China, roughly around 20,000 years before present. Nomads aren't going to carry pottery. Pottery is heavy, it's breakable, and when you're nomadic, you're trying to kind of minimize the weight that you have on your back, the things that you have to carry around. So we don't see pottery emerge really until sedentism emerges, where we can start to store things. Pottery has an advantage with respect to storage because it's relatively impervious. I mean, once it's fired, it protects against water, it protects against rodents, and so for storing grain, for storing seeds, for carrying water, etc., pottery is going to have this big advantage. In the Middle East, we don't see pottery emerge until after we've already shifted to these farming economies. They use baskets more widely for a lot of the Middle East storage and transport. And so Mesolithic foragers have these tool types that are based on these microliths. They practice broad spectrum foraging of a variety of plant and animal resources, and they develop sedentism. They are sedentary hunters and gatherers. As we shift into the Neolithic, we're talking about economies that are based on food cultivation or food production. Um, up to this point, up to the end of the Paleolithic, we're talking about discrete kind of endpoints that are universal wherever in the world you go. And so the Paleolithic ends specifically about 17 to 15,000 years ago when the glaciers are retreating and this broad spectrum habitat or economy is kind of emerging. The Mesolithic and the Neolithic are much more site specific and are really measured by these technology changes. The Mesolithic, its beginning point is when these microliths appear. The Neolithic beginning point or kind of high point is when at least 50% of the diet is is comprised of domesticated plants and animals. So this transition occurs as groups become more domesticated on plants and animals. It's not an overnight kind of thing. You start to dabble in domestication while still hunting and gathering to support yourselves. And as you become better at cultivating crops, you're going to shift to more of your diet being based on domesticated species. These economies fuel pretty large scale population growth, and for a couple of reasons. One, you're no longer nomadic. So, by abandoning nomadism and developing sedentism, you reduce your work effort. You don't have to walk from place to place. Sure, you're still going to walk distances in order to find the calories that you need to consume for that day, but it's not going to be nearly as far as you would have walked if you were following these herds of megafauna. Secondly, we end up with a diet that is less variable, that's more consistent, more constant. So we're no longer cycling through these feast and famine points. We are instead maybe eating a smaller number of calories at any one sitting, but having access to those calories on a more consistent basis. Thirdly, particularly with this reliance on these wild stands of grains. Think about if you've already had children or you've got relatives or friends who've already had children. What is one of the first foods that pediatricians in the United States recommend that parents feed their babies? Well, it's cereal grains. It's specifically rice cereal because it tends not to be allergenic in nature. But really, you're not waiting for teeth to emerge to start introducing babies to solid foods. The conventional recommendation now is that if you're feeding formula, you start to introduce solids between 4 and 6 months. That if you're exclusively breastfeeding, you start to introduce solids no earlier than 6 months, so between about 6 and 9 months, and that you start with things like rice cereal. These things don't require teeth to eat. Babies are certainly capable of eating them without having teeth, just using their tongue and their palate. And anytime that you introduce solid foods to infants, you lessen the energetic demand of lactation. You're basically providing them with an alternative food source, which means they're going to nurse slightly less, which means that women are going to shift in the energy balance and probably resume cycling sooner because of these early weaning foods. If cycling resumes sooner, then you're going to have a shorter interbirth interval between subsequent pregnancies. So that also serves then to kind of boost the birth rate. The signature features of Neolithic economies include a dependence on cultivation, include sedentary lifestyle, and then is often measured through the use of these ceramic vessels as an archaeological marker. And so this is just a diagram showing you what some of these grinding stones are. The typical Neolithic tool was basically a modern mortar and pestle. Represents you put your grains in and then you grind them. That grinding action ends up then resulting in finely polished tools, and so the tools themselves bear marks that show that they've been used to grind grain. We're going to talk specifically about the emergence of herding or farming in the Middle East. Just going to set the stage and understand the process. I'm not generally a stickler for you to know dates and details from specific areas. What I prefer that you glean and use from this information then is kind of the whys and hows of things happening. Understand the broad patterns, understand why certain features emerge. So, in the context of the Middle East, we've got four environmental zones that are really, really close to one another. We call it, and we'll specifically have this on another slide, we call it a vertical economy. What that means is that elevation helps to mediate changes in kind of climate and growing season over a mountainside. And so specifically in the Middle East, in the high plateau above about 5,000 feet, we've got deposits of natural copper. We've got an abundance of raw materials for working with stone tools. This copper is going to play a role later in the emergence of metallurgy and being able to work with and understand the properties of metal. Below the high plateau, we've got the Piedmont Steppe. This is a treeless plain. Below that, we've got the last point, the hilly flanks, which is a subtropical woodland zone that flanks rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, specifically to the north. And then in between those two rivers, we've got the alluvial floodplain. This is what I think you've seen referred to as the quote unquote Fertile Crescent, with the idea that domestication, that farming started on these alluvial floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This actually doesn't bear out to examination. The process of domestication started in the hilly flanks and the neighboring bordering areas, because these were the areas where we had these stands of wild barley, where we had large quantities of gazelles to hunt. And so it was in the hilly flanks that a group of sedentary foragers known as the Natufians were able to start to develop sedentism, followed by the origins of plant animal domestication. And so there are 2 points to bring up with respect to the origins of plant cultivation. One is that the first stab at it, the beginnings of plant and animal domestication, occur in areas that have reliable rainfall. You're not going to start farming in the desert, for example. Why not? Well, the desert doesn't offer us a consistent and seasonally predictable pattern of rainfall. Robert J. Braidwood proposed that food production then began in the hilly flanks, where we had wild wheat and wild barley, where those stands could have become quite prolific. That brings us to our fourth point, that deliberate cultivation most likely came in response to climate change. But once that technology is mastered, there's going to be a rapid spread of technology, particularly in the old world. So Lou Binford discussed this and said that certain areas of the Middle East were so rich in resources that farmers were able to adopt sedentary lifestyles, and lived in settled villages with before the advent of plant and animal domestication. And so, specifically in the Middle East, we have a population of sedentary hunter-gatherers known as the Natufians. They lived in year-round villages between about 12,800 years ago and 10,200 years ago. They did a lot of their foraging in the hilly flanks. Towards the end of their tenure, the climate changed, or right towards the beginning of the Natufian period, the climate changed, allowing for the development of sedentism and broad spectrum foraging. About 11,000 years ago, the environment changed again with a shift towards drier ingredients. Not ingredients, drier conditions. This shift towards drier conditions had followed these population increases that were fueled by domestication, that were fueled by no longer being nomadic. And so Natufians, thusly, by this point, had bigger families and needed to innovate technology in ways to maintain productivity after these drying trends set in. And so what they started doing was intentionally watering plants. So what the Natufians were doing then was, they were trying to support this larger population base um, by transferring these wild cereals to well-watered areas. And so once rainfall became less consistent, then they would start to either transport water or at least transport the plants or the seeds themselves to areas that received more rainfall. And this was really the first kind of step in this process of taking control of plant reproduction. You generally don't see people in the richest areas establish food production. Instead, you find people who either were once in the richest areas and conditions are changing, like the Natufians, or you find people that are in marginal areas and able to see the richness of production of people in those prime areas. So the people who are having trouble following their traditional subsistence strategy are going to be those that are willing to dabble with, and develop new techniques. Sedentary life is a precursor for farming and herding. Natufians built settlements that were occupied year-round. They show permanent architectural features and evidence for the processing and storage of wild grains. The Middle East is characterized by this vertical economy. This is the juxtaposition of environmental zones that's facilitated through gains in elevation. And so people in different seasons move up and down the mountain to be able to move or to cultivate or collect from different seasonally available stands, also to move their animals to grazing lands either higher or lower. The movement of people, animals, and products between these zones is a precondition for the emergence of food production.